Thank you for joining us for another episode of Baker Hosts Ad Nauseam, a podcast series focusing on new and trending advertising issues with an emphasis on the FTC and the NAD. I'm Randall Rubenking, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. We are once again joined by Amy Mudge and Daniel Kaufman, two partners from Baker Hostetler's advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Together, they have decades of advertising experience and approach advertising issues from multiple perspectives. On today's episode of Ad Nauseam, Amy and Daniel talk about some advertising cases relating to food marketing, including some oldies but goodies. With that, welcome to Ad Nauseam, and let's turn it over to Amy and Daniel.
Welcome back to Ad Nauseam, and today we are turning to one of our very favorite topics, food. We're going to look at some older FTC cases that establish many of the principles that food marketers need to be mindful of. We're not going to be talking about taste test issues today. Those come into play largely at NAD. But for food, the FTC has different concerns. We'll definitely come back and do a taste test podcast soon, as those are both juicy and spicy. But today is food and FTC.
And delicious, Amy. And we are always delighted to turn it back a few decades and take a deeper dive into some of the older FTC cases that really were pivotal and are pivotal in how the law has developed. And having the cases focus on food just makes it that much more delicious.
You and I do love looking back in history, Daniel, don't we? But before we dive into this topic du jour, we haven't really focused on food and pop culture. And I know, I think you're still binging The Bear. I got through it like very first weekend. But there are a lot of other great TV shows and movie history that deal with food and with restaurants. So Daniel, what are some of your faves?
So going back to, I think it was the 70s, I was a huge fan of the show Alice, which of course took place in Mel's Diner. And the wonderful Linda Lavin and Polly Holiday as Flo and Beth Howland, who I just adore and was so wonderful in Company and the cast recording of Company. So Alice is definitely up there for me. I love the show Chopped. Give me some crazy ingredients and see what they create. And finally, I am an obsessive fan of the British Baking Show, and I can't wait for the new season to begin.
You were an early adopter. In fact, you turned me on to that. The show that I call like TV Valium.
But it's both stressful and delightfully pleasant, and the contestants are just so wonderful, and they're all so quirky, and they help each other. It's just this idyllic sort of show, I think.
Totally agree. But Daniel, pulling out Alex, I bow. I can't compete. We're done. But all right, I'll go to movies. I'll go back to the 80s. Mystic Pizza. I think it was Julia Roberts' first star turn. And I think her hair was my favorite. I think it filled the entire screen, the entire movie. I think it was way before there were products there. But I have to say, if I'm going to go, one that has stood the test of time and I think is the most delightful is Ratatouille. It's Patton Oswalt. It's just like so good. And Big Night. Anything with Stanley Tucci, I am there for. And I also really loved anything that Anthony Bourdain did. I loved his TV shows. I loved his book. I loved eating steak at Leal back in the day. But I will say that most of the cooking competitions just totally stress me out. And I will go food fiction any day.
Well, I would love to talk about food all day. And before we jump into the law, though, I do want to know, Amy, if you have to pick your last meal, what would it be?
Ooh, last meal. No, easy. Lasagna and wedding cake.
Interesting. No, I have had mine established forever. And you're going to think Daniel's going to pick something fancy. No, I am not. I would want an old school McDonald's hot apple pie from when we were kids that no longer exist.
Fried, not baked. 100%, sir.
And a Carvel ice cream cone with sprinkles. They're not Jimmy's, they're sprinkles. So that would be my choice.
I live near a Carvel, and when I need to suck up to you for something, I will bring you a Fudgy the Whale cake.
I do love that. Okay, so time to turn to a little bit of food law. And I guess the first big consideration we've seen in food cases is issues involving sort of the inevitable body weight issues, whether it's fat content or the healthiness of a product. We've seen a lot of cases that raise concerns about the type of food marketing claims that might appeal to sort of the more weight conscious consumers.
All right, let's kick it back to 1995, the year that I graduated from law school, and talk about an FTC case involving Eskimo pie, which I will note has gone through a name change because its name is considered offensive now towards native Arctic communities, and it's now the Eddie Pie. But nonetheless, it still remains a delicious vanilla ice cream bar with a chocolatey coating. So, what could be wrong with that? Well, nearly 30 years ago, the FTC brought an action involving a version of the product that was sugar free. It used artificial sweetener, and then get nothing wrong with that. Delicious and sugar free. But the FTC was concerned that some of their marketing claims were over the top.
And first up, we had a pretty basic endorsement problem. Several of the ads talked about being partners with the American Diabetes Association and about being a proud sponsor of the ADA. But according to the FTC's complaint, these statements were akin to an approval or an endorsement by the ADA, and the FTC alleged the ADA had in fact not endorsed this suite of products. So that is one count.
And then the second, I think the primary issue really involves statements about calories and also about fat content. So the marketing for the product talked about smarter eating with things like slim down for summer, and it showed people exercising and jogging. But according to the FTC, ever the buzzkill, the products were not significantly reduced in calories, even though they didn't have sugar. So when you compared them to comparable foods, they generally weren't low in calories. So the agency felt that was just a big no go from the start.
And there's another really interesting count there, and that is the old deceptive failure to disclose, which I always think is an interesting area. You make a statement, and what are you not saying that you sort of should have been saying? And here, given that the company was making some good for diabetics type claims, the FTC alleged that it was therefore also a deceptive omission to not disclose that the products were indeed high in total fat and saturated fat and were not reduced calories, which is information relevant to diabetics. The remedy here required a disclosure, fat content, and not reduced calories for any future statements that the product was a useful or appropriate part of a diabetic's diet.
Okay, I really want dessert now, but let's move on to the entrees. There was a similar case that came out now in 2004 involving KFC or Kentucky Fried Chicken.
So, Amy, right around that time, I was living somewhere and I'd walk by a KFC every time on the way to work, and I was obsessed and addicted to their honey barbecue wings, and I'd often pick them up. One day home, I was really hungry, and I'm like, I'm gonna make it a double and bring home a double portion of those, and I lived to regret it. They were delicious and wonderful, but probably one order is sufficient, I will say.
Okay, that's it's a sometimes food, maybe, to quote our dear friend Cookie Monster. All right, well, fascinating. But we have a podcast to focus on, Daniel. So, the FTC's KFC, it's a lot of initials, FTC's KFC case was focused on nutrition value and healthfulness and compatibility with weight loss claims. And this was really in the peak era of the focus on the Atkins low carb diets. It was before we knew the word keto, but same kind of concept. And so, what KFC was doing, well, among the claims, and the context in the ad was that there was a couple, and they were talking about eating better, okay, and that two original recipe chicken breasts from KFC have less fat than a Whopper, and that choice was a low carb food choice.
You know, Amy, I always like it when the FTC is focusing on like what is important in culture and what's a significant issue that's out there. And that was very relevant to the KFC issue and consumer interpretation. But the other thing that I think is kind of interesting here, the FTC generally doesn't focus a lot on comparative claims. But first and foremost, here they defended the King and the Whopper and alleged that eating two fried chicken breasts is not better for a consumer's health than eating a Whopper. And the complaint called that out with some comparative nutrition facts to publicly make that point. But then they also went after the claims that eating the fried chicken was compatible with low carb weight loss programs noting that low carb weight loss programs back then, such as Atkins, specifically advised against eating breaded, fried, and delicious foods.
Absolutely. And another interesting thing about that case was a statement that was issued by then Commissioner Pamela Jones Harbor. Now, she concurred with the settlement, but she pushed for stronger relief. She said, "Look, the nation's increasing obesity rate is a real concern," and she pushed for monetary relief in cases like this going forward. And this was really during a time when most of the FTC's settlements were more injunctive only, particularly in the national advertising space. But this is certainly consistent with what we've seen other commissioners push for more generally in the past few years.
But it's not always about weight loss and diet. So, broader health issues often come to play in health cases. And we had a 1991 case involving Bertolli olive oil, which addressed the health benefits of olive oil. Now, I do want to emphasize that on this one, which was more than 30 years ago, it wouldn't shock me if the science has shifted in the decades since the case was brought.
Mhm.
But let's, go back to 1991. The FTC was concerned then about certain health claims that were made for olive oil that exceeded the then existing science.
And so there were full page ads in newspapers, kicking it back old school, back to the 90s, and that represented in these ads that eating olive oil reduces blood pressure and blood sugar, and that it was proven by science, and that cooking with olive oil reduces cholesterol more than cooking with other oils. And really, that the ads were designed to capitalize on a then recent Journal of American Medical Association article, or JAMA, that had compared certain health issues for olive oil, butter, and vegetable oils. And the JAMA article had some good things to say about olive oil consumption, but they didn't go quite as far as the ad campaign did. And the FTC's complaint emphasized what the JAMA study did not find, as well as the qualified nature of the JAMA findings, which expressly noted the need for further study. And in particular, the FTC said the JAMA study did not report that olive oil was healthier than other oils or that olive oil reduced the HDL cholesterol.
Amy, if there was one common theme I would see in so many cases when I was at the FTC is that you would take a good and interesting study like the JAMA one you're talking about, and just someone would get carried away with it and go beyond,
Absolutely.
yeah, just going beyond what the findings support, which is sort of, I think, a broader lesson.
That trend continues, my friend. We see it all the time with the
Shockingly so.
studies. Yeah, well, the studies that they're really good and promising studies, but then say, this is we need to study this further, and people forget that. They get excited by the provisional or the initial findings.
Now, I will say I am a huge olive oil user, and I'm also slightly spoiled because my sister in law's family has a very small olive farm in Italy, and I once in a while do
Ooh,
get an amazing bottle of fresh Italian olive oil.
you've never shared with me any of
Yeah.
this olive
In the
oil,
odd
but
chance that they're listening, I am due for sort of another shipment. But let's turn to kids instead, because the FTC is of course focused on kids' foods, kids' nutrition for quite some time. And one area they've been active in is baby formula, and we have a twofer here, two cases over time involving Gerber baby formula, one involving targeted efficacy claims and another involving endorsements.
let's be clear, the baby formula companies have been fighting for decades in front of the NAD on all sorts of issues. But once in a while, the FTC gets involved. And back in 97, Gerber advertised that 4 out of 5 pediatricians recommended their baby food. But according to the FTC, that wasn't quite the case, and the actual survey numbers told a slightly different story. In fact, the FTC noted that, if anything, most of the pediatricians didn't recommend any specific brand of baby formula.
And in a totally unrelated case that the agency brought many years later, the FTC initiated litigation in connection with a claim that a certain baby formula could reduce the risk of the little one developing certain allergies. There's also an interesting count there where the agency alleged that the company had implied that the product had received approval for a health claim from the Food and Drug Administration, when in fact the FDA had said it would consider exercising its enforcement discretion to allow defendant to make a highly qualified health claim.
What I find fascinating about that case is that it actually litigated for nearly 5 years. And when it eventually settled, it was for pretty narrow injunctive relief. That's pretty rare in the FTC world, even today's FTC world. I can't honestly imagine how much was spent on attorney's fees for that one, but c'est la vie.
I am sure it was a high price tag. But anyway, Amy, take us home. What are some pointers that we should leave folks with on this issue?
It's interesting, Daniel, because we really did focus on 90s and aughts type cases, but they're oldies but goodies, and we still see these lessons today that I think food marketers continue to struggle with. So a couple of things to think about. Be really careful about your health claims, and that includes cases about weight loss. Don't forget that FDA has a big role to play here as well. And there really is a focus on the need for significant scientific agreement before making claims that a food can reduce the risk of a disease or a health condition. Number two, and I think we really hammered this home today, don't exaggerate the science, especially if it's emerging science, and be really careful with clinically proven claims or clinically studied claims. Those are establishment claims that have a very high bar. Number three, even though we didn't talk about them today, don't forget the potential for NAD challenges. And certainly at NAD, as a food company, you will get challenged on a much wider range of issues, including taste and sensory comparative claims. And last but not least, if you're looking for folks to test new and delicious food products, Daniel and I are always available for sampling duty.
And with that, we thank you very much for joining us for an episode of Ad Nauseam.
Get a snack and come join us next time.
Thank you, Amy and Daniel. If you have any questions for Amy or Daniel, their contact information is in the show notes. For more information on the latest developments in ad law, visit our Adventures in Law blog at www.adventures-in-law.com and check out all Ad Nauseam episodes by subscribing to Baker Hosts wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.